that God had appointed, and he's kind of we always talk about the chief high priest, but he's at the main one that Jesus is compared to, especially in this chapter. Now, he's compared to high priest in general before this, but in this one he's compared to him there. Now, there's not a lot of references to him, and we're going to look at a couple of those in just a minute on where he's mentioned as far as, where he's first mentioned in the Old Testament. So we'll get to that, but just kind of keep in mind that's part of that high priest that we're going to be thinking about today, and that basically that comparison with Jesus there. So, all right, so let's get into chapter 5, verse 1. So as we continue on to those last few verses of chapter 4, it continues on talking about the qualifications of the high priest there, of the priesthood, that was given. So in verse 1, it says, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin." And so we think about several of those different points there, but when we think about the sacrifices, what did the priests do under the old law? What was a big part of their job? When we think about the high priest in the Old Testament. Okay, all right, so the offering of the sacrifices. Let's turn back to Exodus chapter 28, verse 1, if somebody'd like to read that for me. So Exodus 28, verse 1. And there'll be a few different passages we'll look at in the Old Testament here. So if you have your Bibles, if somebody else would like to turn to Numbers 3, verse 10 for me. Okay. All right. So again, we see the high priest there. We think about Aaron and his sons and those that were mentioned. And we know that the high priest came through the lineage of Aaron there as it continued on to his sons. Who's got Numbers 3, verse 10? Okay. All right. So again, we see Aaron referenced there as well in the high priest setting, and there was several guidelines and restrictions that the priest and the high priest had to meet. So some of that was physical perfection that God required, ceremonial cleanliness, full obedience to God's commands. And some of those things can be read about in Leviticus chapter 21 if you want to read that on your own time. But there was a lot of different qualifications to be a high priest there. It wasn't something that you could necessarily work towards. It was something that God would appoint you if you met those qualifications at the time of being needed there. We talked about the sacrifices there and the most holy place on the Day of Atonement. To offer those sacrifices for the people. Again, in Leviticus chapter 16, verses 1 through 34, you can see some of that as far as the sacrifices and how that was to be done. And we know that with all of the old law, there were strict rules that God had on how everything was to be carried out, how the tabernacle and temple was to be prepared, and just like Roger's taught in several lessons recently, as far as the different rings that were on the curtains and things like that. All of that was down to the very detail, and that continued on with the priests there, and they were expected to be held to hold a higher standard as the high priest for the children of Israel at that time. The role was something that a man could not appoint himself to be. It was something that God had to appoint them to do. You couldn't just say that you wanted to be the priest and everybody vote for you. It didn't work that way. God would be the one that would appoint you. It was a divine appointment, and it was meant to symbolize holiness, and it was also a big purpose of that was for intercession. So intercession and mediation between God and Israel. And then we still need that today. And as we start to make that comparison with Jesus in this chapter, and that he's the greater high priest, we know that we need that mediator, and he is our chief mediator today. But what does it mean to have a mediator between us and God? Why is that important? What does that mean to us today? Okay. All right. So it's the way that we can get to God, the way that we can communicate with God. Why is that? Why do we need a mediator? So we know that Jesus is our mediator. We talk about that a lot. But why is it needed? Why can't we just skip the middleman if you think about that? Yeah. Okay. All right. So good point. So when we sin, what does that do with us and God? It separates us, right? So we lose that connection when we sin. So we need somebody to basically kind of bridge that gap. So so Jesus is the one. And why is he qualified to do that? He paid the price, right? He lived the perfect life for us, and he paid the price for our sins and died for us there. So that bridge was made bridge was made through Jesus so that we could be able to approach God again and be able to pray to him and communicate in that way. So so Jesus is our mediator there. So let's look at a couple of other Old Testament examples, though. Let's look at, somebody turn back to Leviticus 16, verse 6, and also verse 15 for me. And then someone else turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 28. And we'll just read a couple different verses there. So the first one is Leviticus 16:6 and 16, verse 15. Yeah, 16:6. 16 verse 6 and 16 verse 15. All right, and then also verse 15 of the same chapter.
Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, bring its blood inside the veil, do with blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it on the mercy seat before the mercy seat.
Okay. All right. So we just see just kind of a sampling there of what a priest was to do at that time. And then also 1 Samuel 2:28, if anybody has that.
Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod with gold? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel.
Okay. All right. So again, we see the offerings there and then what was to be done. So, all right, let's continue to verses 2 and 3 of Hebrews chapter 5. So in verse 2, it says, he can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. And then verse 3, because of this, he is required as for the people, so also for himself to offer sacrifices for sin there. So we see again that the high priest understands basically the human frailty that we have, because he is a human himself. We think about under the old law, but then also think about Jesus, that he came to earth to live in human form, and he experienced the exact same things that we do in our lives, but he was able to withstand those temptations and that type thing. So, but the high priest had that same knowledge and that same understanding of those that he represents as a mediator to God there. So again, that kind of underscores the reason of why we need another reason for why we need the mediator in Jesus there. Also, he must also offer sacrifices for himself as the high priest. So under the old law, when they would make the sacrifices, it would be for them too. So it wasn't just for the people, it'd be for them. But why would Jesus be greater than a high priest in that way? Correct. So he never sinned. He lived the perfect life. He did not need a sacrifice for his sins. He did not have any, but his sacrifice was for us. So again, we see the superiority of Jesus there in that way as the great high priest. Let's look at Hebrews 7, verse 27. It kind of underscores that. So just turn over a page or two. Hebrews 7, verse 27, it says, "Who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself." So again, we see that Jesus did not need a sacrifice for himself, that his sacrifice was all for us. Verse 4, that divine appointment there, as it talks about, it says, "And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was." So again, the high priest couldn't make that determination for himself there, but would be called by God. Let's look at John chapter 3, verse 27. John 3:27. 3:27 says, "John answered and said, 'A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven.'" Again, kind of continuing on that point, that part about the appointment there by God. All right, Hebrews 5, verses 5 and 6. It says, "So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he also says in another place, 'You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.'" So we see again that God is the one that says that. When it says there in verse 5 that it says, "He who said to him," we see he is capitalized. We know that that's God. And he says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And we think about that, again, that sacrifice of Jesus and what, as God said, he was his begotten son there. All right, somebody turn to Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. That's referenced there. And then also, if someone would like to turn to Psalm 110, verse 4 as well. As you guys are turning there, as we think about the appointment of Jesus, when a high priest was appointed, his term would come to an end when he passed away. But we know Jesus' term is eternal. He will always be our mediator, and that'll be mentioned in the second verse that we'll be reading. But somebody read Psalm 2, verse 7 for us.
I will declare and decree, the Lord has said to me, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.'"
Okay. All right. And then Psalm 110, verse 4, if somebody has that.
The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
Okay. All right. So again, Jesus will be our priest forever. And then I'll turn over. Let's look at Matthew 3:17. I'll read that. But Matthew chapter 3, verse 17. "And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" So again, we see that that Jesus, of course, is the Son of God, and that's underscored in those verses as well there. All right, let's look at verse 7 in chapter 5. So Hebrews 5:7 says, "Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear." And then we'll continue in verse 8. It says, "Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered." All right, so again, we see the suffering of Jesus there and that of his sacrifice, but it says in the days of his flesh. What does that phrase mean, in the days of his flesh? Okay, so while he was living, in the days of his flesh, he offered up prayers and supplications, and then talks about the cries and the tears there. We know that even though Jesus is divine, even though he is partially God, he felt the same pain here on earth as we would. He didn't use any miraculous power to avoid that pain. We know he had to experience the same pain that we would have if we had gone through that same situation. Jesus suffered for us. He prayed for us, but he cried out in anguish whenever he was suffering in that way. We don't want to overlook that. And we talk about, every first day of the week, we talk about his death, and we remember that in several lessons and sermons and invitations. But we don't want to forget that he did actually suffer. It wasn't a miracle that he didn't feel anything or didn't experience any of those things. He went through the same pain that we would have if we had been in his shoes in that way, and even more so when you think about that. So we know that dying for us was not an easy thing for him to do. He didn't want to do that. He asked if that cup should pass from him. He prayed to God that if it could, that it would. But God said, you're my begotten son, and he knew that what he had to do for us. But the human part of him still struggled just as we would throughout that process of being put to death there. Several verses for us kind of bring that out for us. Somebody turn over to Luke chapter 22. Verse 44. We'll look at a couple different verses here. So somebody turn to Luke 22:44. And then also, if someone else would like to turn to Matthew 26:39. And then we'll have a third verse if somebody would like. Isaiah 53:3 and 4. So again, with these three verses, we start to see, and we can understand what Jesus went through, that he needed to go through these things for us, but also that he did ask, that the cup pass it if possible. But all right, so Luke 22:44.
Being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground.
Okay. All right. And the sweat we think about from time to time of being like great drops of blood, and how amazing of that agony that would have been there. But that whole verse, brings that out really clearly for us. Also, Matthew 26, verse 39.
Going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.
Okay. Thank you. So again, not as Jesus willed. Again, he wanted to do what God wanted him to do. And he asked that, but he knew that at the end of the day, that's still what he would need to do. And then Isaiah 53:3 and 4.
He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted.
Okay. All right. We think about he was acquainted with grief there. So again, he knew that he experienced those pains just as we would have, the grief that came along with that. And he experienced grief throughout his life too, with all of the the things that he went through, and of course with those that passed away around him from time to time, like Lazarus, and those things bothered him just like it would us. But he handled all of those things in a much better way than we could ever hope to. Jesus, again, was superior in those ways, and he's superior as our high priest there as well. All right, let's look at verse 8 as well. Then it says, and we read this earlier, but though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. So again, those things that we just talked about, it says he learned obedience. What do you think about that phrase when it says that Jesus learned obedience? Did he need to actually learn that? To me, it's kind of an odd phrase in that verse, but what do you think about that, learned obedience? Okay. All right. What else? Anybody else have any thoughts with that? Learning obedience? Yeah, so he was giving. He had that heart of wanting to give. Of course, he knew obedience, but he experienced that again just like us. So he was required to. Jesus didn't have to obey when he was on this earth, but he did, and he experienced that. And so the word learned there to me goes with experienced, the cost of obedience there, and more the cost of that our sin cost him that, and that he learned the cost there, through his life and through that sacrifice. But his suffering was part of the perfect qualification to be our high priest. So we talked about the qualifications of high priest earlier, and we didn't get into a lot of detail on those, but he had the perfect qualification. So even though the other high priests had high standards, they were not perfect. They were still men, and they still had sin in their lives, but Jesus had that perfect qualification there. Someone turn over to Philippians 2:8 for us. Philippians 2:8. And while you're turning there, I'll turn over to Romans 5:19. It's always good to reference different passages when you're studying a chapter or different verses, just to get other viewpoints from other writers. that the Holy Spirit inspired throughout the Scriptures, but to see some different thoughts about things that you're studying. So Philippians 2:8, if somebody could read that. Okay. All right. So we see that humility of Jesus, even to that point of death there. And then also Romans 5:19, for as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many were made righteous. What does it mean, one man's disobedience, in the first part of that? Okay. All right. So Adam sinned. Adam and Eve were the first to sin. We see as by their disobedience many were made sinners. So sin was introduced to the world. It was introduced to mankind. So many were made sinners, and then also by one man's obedience. So it started with one, and then it ended with one, with Jesus' obedience towards that righteousness there for us. So again, he was able to pave the path for us to have that opportunity to have that forgiveness of sins there. All right, verse 9 in chapter 5, it says, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey. So that having been perfected, once his life ended, it was perfected. He had lived that perfect life, the life that nobody else could do, that he went through that. So his life was perfected there, and he became the author of eternal salvation. What do you think about that phrase, author of eternal salvation, when you hear that? When we think about an author, we usually think of them as a writer, but they're also a creator, right? So they create whatever story it is that we're reading. Jesus was the author of salvation. He created that opportunity for salvation for us. He not only was our creator, that we can have that salvation, but he also created that opportunity by living that perfect life there and completing that mission that he had. He is the source of our eternal salvation. We always want to remember that when we think about the author or the source there. So a lot of things to keep in mind about Jesus as he is the chief high priest for us. But also, let's turn over to Acts chapter 4, verse 12. Acts chapter 4, verse 12 says, nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. And so again, no salvation in any other. Again, Jesus is the author of our salvation. John 14:6 also tells us that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And also in Romans 8:34 tells us again that he intercedes for us, and that he is our mediator. So if we're praying for salvation, it's almost second nature for all of us to pray to Jesus. But what do other people throughout the world who aren't Christians, who do they look for salvation? I kind of made it a little list of some that I've thought of, but when you think about the world today and those that don't necessarily pray to Jesus, who do others look to for their salvation and put their faith in? Say again? Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Allah. Okay, I had Allah down. Yep, so we know the faith of Islam prays to Allah. Who else? Mary. I had Mary on the list too. So sometimes people will mention Mary and trying to gain salvation through her. Who else? Buddha. I had that one as well. So Buddha is one. Any others you can think of? Yeah, true. Yeah, of different false gods. Okay. I had the Pope. I wrote the Pope down. Some people look to themselves, are so self-absorbed they look to themselves. Some people think about St. Peter. You hear that phrase mentioned a lot together. And I'm sure you guys can think of others too, but that's a lot of different ones just in that short list. And then there's so many others that people will look to for some kind of salvation, or they'll put their faith in when we know that only God and Jesus is the only place for that faith. So we're going to run out of time, so we'll move on to verse 10. Verse 10 says, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. And the last part of verse 11 and the next few verses is a good place to kind of stay for just a little bit as we think about some different points as far as when we first started this study. We talked about who this letter was written to. It's written to the Hebrew Christians. The Hebrew Christians were starting to lose faith. They were starting to even consider going back to being Jews, leaving the church, going back to Judaism. So a lot of things were happening here. And the end of this verse even kind of goes into that a little further, that not only were maybe they losing faith because of those things, but maybe they were getting a little lazy too. And we see here, and when we think about that, it says you have become dull of hearing. We'll think about that in just a second as we get into the end of that verse. But it's something that we all, I think, can apply to ourselves as well and kind of take note of where we stand as we get to that. But in verse 10, first of all, it says, called by God as a high priest according to that order of Melchizedek. So we see a lot of repetition in the last few verses. And I wonder if that's by design by the writer here, because again, he says that they're dull of hearing. So is he saying these things a few different times because they're not catching it, or because he really needs it to sink in with them that Jesus is the high priest, and again, he is superior. So the last 5 chapters, Jesus is superior, he's superior, he's superior. So he's trying to bring this point home to him. But then as we get into him saying that they're dull of hearing, or maybe lazy, or that they're not listening and making application, again, we see maybe that was a reason why he brought this out so many times in the repetition of saying these things. But again, as he references Melchizedek, he again knows that that's at least a point that they've known all their lives, that he was the high priest, someone that they knew that they could again make that application to as they're trying to navigate through if they're going to stay a Christian or if they're going to backtrack and go back to Judaism. So he was again making that application to them. But let's think about that verse 11 for just a little bit. Well, actually, we'll go ahead and read the next 3 verses and kind of just combine all that together. But in verse 11 again, it says, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. So we see he's going back and teaching some of those first things as far as the high priest, who that was, and now that Jesus, which they should have already been very familiar with by this point, Jesus was their high priest. But he says, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And then he continues on, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And of course, we know this passage should be very familiar to all of us. We talk about this a lot as far as being unskilled in the word and the need for maturity, and that's exactly what this context is leading to. So if they would have been more grounded in faith, as the Hebrew Christians here, they would have been more skillful. But now he's saying, hey, we should be growing, the church should be growing, you all should be growing in your faith, but instead now we've got to backtrack and go back to your roots to explain why you're even here, why you're even in the church at this time. So they were having a challenging time with this. So I just thought that was interesting that as you think about the context and as it kind of flows through to that point, that a lot of times we'll kind of break off those last 3 verses in our lessons or invitations or sermons, but that's where that all kind of came about. It kind of flows in to that there. So we're going to think about that a little bit more with those verses. So that thought of dull of hearing is that basically he's saying, I would like to go deeper than just telling you about the high priest that you've known about all your life, but I can't do that yet. So he's saying he's got to kind of stay with just the milk of the word and trying to just keep them on board instead of going to that next level of, hey, we need you teaching others and spreading the gospel with that way. So that word dull, it can literally mean sluggish or lazy. So dull of hearing, lazy hearing. They're not actively listening to God's word, and we can just, all of these things we can apply to ourselves. Were we actively listening to Jason's lesson this morning? Maybe we were, maybe we weren't, but we want to make sure that we're always taking stock of where we are with every little thing that God asks us to do. We want to continue to remember that spiritual understanding requires effort and alertness. It takes work on our part to grow. And we think about maturing in the Word and growing as a Christian. It takes work. It's something that's not just, you can't just go on cruise control and expect to be better now than you were a year ago from a spiritual standpoint. It does take some effort with that. Verse 12, when it talks about you ought to be teachers, it says, by now these Christians should be mature enough to be able to teach others. And again, he has to backtrack there, but now they're still on the first principles. They're still on the basic truths of what they need to know. And again, he wanted to go further with that, but he couldn't, at least the writer couldn't at that point, with them. Talks about the milk of the Word or foundational teachings. As we become a Christian, we learn the basics, and then as we grow as a Christian, we should start to go to the next steps on different things that we learn, not only about our faith now, but what the children of Israel went through. As we learn what they went through, then we can grow from that. When we see what the prophets did in the Old Testament, all of those things we can build upon and help us to mature as Christians as well. We should always be growing in knowledge as we think about that. Not staying at that beginner level. And I mentioned that earlier. If you look back to August, first week of August of last year, do you think you're a little stronger than you were then? Do you think you're about the same? Or are you a little weaker than you were then? It's something to consider. Or what about 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Or when you first became a Christian, are you still at that level? Or have you expanded in that way? And we want to remember that becoming mature as a Christian doesn't just mean we're mature in age. We know there's a lot of folks that are very mature at a young age and that are very active in teaching others, and then others that are mature at an older age and very active. But we want to always be working to improve that spiritual maturity as we do that. Verse 13 talks about those that were unskilled in the Word or inexperienced in using the Bible. They were spiritual babies, not ready for deeper teaching. And again, that seemed to be a disappointment here to the writer of Hebrews, as again, he was wanting to get some other things across to them. But just application. Without regular Bible study, we're going to remain immature, really, from a spiritual standpoint. Without regular prayer to God, without regular discussions with other Christians, we're not going to see that growth that God wants us to have, and get to the meat of the Word if we don't put in a little work in that way. Discernment is sharpened by constant use and exercise of the Word. So as we think about being skilled in the Word, it takes exercise or practice, just like being skilled in any other thing that we do in life. So again, we need to practice with that as well. And then, like I say, again, with obedience and practice, we can build our spiritual maturity and not just our knowledge there. So it's one thing just to know the facts about the Bible, but it's another thing to be able to apply it. And then just as the Hebrew writer wanted them to do, it's that other next level to be able to teach someone else the basics of what they need to do to become a Christian there. So any comments this morning before we finish up? Okay, well, I appreciate everyone's comments and helping read this morning, and we'll continue on with chapter